Hey guys, I really thought about starting this video with some 80s karaoke, but I'm gonna spare you and say that I have a whole week that I dedicated to 80s videos. I will link those videos below and you can go listen to me completely embarrass myself and sing 80s songs to you. It's actually mortifying for me to listen to those videos again, so go have a good laugh at my expense. What I would like to start this video with is sharing an audiobook that I'm listening to, and it brings me back to something special about the 80s. I was an 80s kid, so I was 5 when it turned 1980, right? And 1990, I was 15. So my Wonder Years, if you will. Do you remember the show, The Wonder Years? One of the most amazing shows ever. My Wonder Years were in the decade of the 80s. And one of the things that was so amazing to me about the decade and the Wonder Years was learning about our world, our universe, and thinking about what outer space meant. The fact that there was space beyond Earth and that it was endless. We don't know where the boundaries are, and there's still so little to be known about outer space. I spent a lot of that decade learning about what may exist beyond our solar system and what we think we know about it and what we don't know about it. Anyway, the book is by Chris Hadfield. Here's the picture. An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, What Going to Space Taught Me About Ingenuity, Determination, and Being Prepared for Anything. So I think a lot about wondering and the possibilities and what lay ahead in the future and all of that when I think about the 80s. And there's so much else I think about. I have 2 videos where I take a trip down memory lane and fragrances associated with those that I'll also link below, and you're welcome to go enjoy some stories from the past. But I will share that for today's look, I pulled out my 80s Aquanet to set my curls in place. Now it's super humid here in Central Virginia, so my curls have fallen out, but you know, good old Aquanet, we pay tribute to you today. We're almost 3 minutes in. Let's jump into the actual fragrances. I'm cheating just a little bit because some of the fragrances that I'm going to mention were actually released in the late 70s, but they had a huge moment in the 80s. And when I think about them, I remember the 80s. Before we get started, I would love for you to say down below in the comments, which fragrance do you think is the most iconic from that era? When you think about 80s perfume, what comes to mind? The first one is a little bit of a cheat. It's Magie Noir, which was released in 1978 from Lancome. This fragrance is classic 80s to me in the sense that it's really green and woody and a little bit like wet earthy. To me, it's aromatic. It's got a little bit of powder, but it's also like very animalic. Now, if you look on Fragrantica at the Accords, animalic is listed at the very bottom. But the reason that I point that out is because in comparison to today's fragrances, which I think for the most part, you have some oudi fragrances out there now. You've got some super sweet florals, some really gourmand fragrances. Those are having a moment. This is particularly animalic in comparison to maybe some of the more popular fragrances of today. Then there is one that launched really in the early 70s, but I think had a really big moment in the 80s or continued to have a moment well into the 80s. And it's one that I don't hear a lot of folks talking about at all. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone mention this, at least in any of the videos I have watched on YouTube. Estee Lauder's Private Collection. This is one of the original formulations. These are harder and harder to find. Look at the color of the juice. There is one that is sold by Estee Lauder now, but I think it's called L'Eau de Private Collection or something like that. It's a reformulated version and it's lighter. This is the original. This is one of, to me, the most realistic garden kinds of fragrances, meaning photorealistic. It gives you the sense that you're actually in a garden, smelling vegetation that has been dampened by rain, and it's the middle of the summer and the earth is giving up its aroma. It's wafting through the air combined with fresh florals. This is super green. It's super floral. It's a little bit herbal as well. aromatic, mossy, and earthy. This is a beauty. I don't know that this would go over very well today. I have really good memories of this. I like it a lot. And it's hard to find. I would recommend the original formulation if you can get your hands on it. I haven't tried the new one, so I can't speak to that, but this is gorgeous. The next two are from COCO. So Chanel number 5 has had its moment from its release to now and still continuing to have moments and moments upon moments. But one that is, to me, very representative of the 80s is COCO. And this is the Eau de Parfum Concentration. This is one that I associate with the matriarchs in my family. There's something really regal and beautiful about this fragrance in an old school vintage way, but not like outdated, you know, fuddy-duddy kind of smell. I still enjoy wearing this and feel really elegant when I put it on. It is spicy, it's ambery, it's got a hint of sweet just to kind of round out that spice, but not, I wouldn't call this a sweet fragrance. And it's definitely powdery and has some woodiness to it. COCO, one of, to me, the most elegant fragrances out of the house of Chanel. Another Chanel that had a big moment in the 80s, although it was, I think, released in the 70s, is Chanel number 19. This is the Eau de Parfum Concentration. I ran through a bottle of the EDT. You wear a fragrance so much that you become sort of saturated with it. You've had enough and you want to break from it. So I ended up selling that and then recently repurchased this concentration, the Eau de Parfum. This is one of the classic powdery green fragrances, very heavy in the 80s. I think I wore this even into the 90s. And then definitely wore it in the 2010 range of my life. I enjoy this. This is a difficult fragrance for many to wear. You can see that the fluid inside is this beautiful greenish color. It's earthy, it's woody, it's got a little bit of iris in it. Even a tiny bit of citrus. But more than anything, it's green and earthy and powdery. Another tiny bit of a cheat because it came out in the late 70s, but boy, did this become super popular through the 80s, especially the early to the mid 80s. And it is from Estee Lauder White Linen. Another, I think, very difficult fragrance for a lot of people to wear today, but it was huge in that time period. This is like your classic clean laundry smell to the max, like an extreme version of that. I think when people think of clean laundry smells, they tend to think of like your cotton fragrances from the Klein line, like your warm cotton, cotton or linen cotton or whatever that whole range is. But I think of White Linen. It says that this is a floral and it says that this is fresh. Yes, it's fresh. Yes, it's floral. But more than anything to me, it is incredibly aldehydic, meaning for me, it's like that classic aldehyde smell that comes across like laundry straight out of the dryer, or if you have dried the laundry out on the line in the sun, the very potent smell you get of dried detergent smell on your clothing. Beautiful fragrance, not for the faint of heart. This is a beast mode fragrance that will take over a room in a minute. It's very green as well, so I would call it a green aldehydic clean fragrance. Yes, it's got florals, but that's more toned down, in my opinion, than the accords that I just mentioned. In honor of that 1980s era of big space flight and little girls like me dreaming of being an astronaut and dreaming of the world beyond our planet, I am wearing a shirt that represents that. For me, it is the Tomorrowland Dreamers Society shirt from Disney. From Tomorrowland in Disney, which is one of my favorite places still. And I went there so much as a kid and loved going to Tomorrowland and to Space Mountain and to the Carousel of Time, I think it's called. Who remembers that? It pivots and it shows a family at different eras in time up to the present. Wonderful stuff. So anyway, all of that brings back good 80s memories for me. Okay, next fragrance. I'm laughing because if you saw my declutter video that I tried to do and failed at, this fragrance was in that video. I was supposed to be getting rid of it because my family can't stand it. I don't love it myself, but I like it enough to want to try it again, so I kept it. So I haven't decided if I still want to sell it, but for right now, I think I'm going to keep it and maybe just, somebody called it closet spraying. I had never heard that term before, and it made me laugh, like spray when no one's looking or no one's at the house. It is Opium by Yves Saint Laurent. So this wasn't, I don't think, created in the 80s. It was created before that. So maybe this is another cheat, but it had this enormous popularity in the 80s. My mom wore this. A lot of my aunts wore this. I remember this being a really overwhelming smell. Now, this particular one is a reformulation from, let's see here, I think it's 2009. Yeah, 2009. But the 80s version was like super bombastic and loud and projecting out into the room and taking over the space. Very spicy, very balsamic, very ambery is what I remember. Some patchouli in here, but just a loud, super 80s DNA kind of fragrance. Another fragrance that had huge moments of popularity in the 80s, and it seemed like everyone had a bottle, is Shalimar. Now, this is a newer formulation in this prettier bottle. The 80s version came in a different package. This one here. This fragrance is like Opium. This was one that was iconic in the 80s. It seemed like every grown woman had a bottle of Shalimar and was unafraid to splash themselves with it. Those came in the dabber bottles where you actually had to take the little dabber out and put it on you. But boy, was it super powerful. Another very bombastic fragrance. The formulation today is still pretty strong, but nothing like what I remember in the 80s. This is ambery. It has some citrus, but it's mostly like a woody amber balsamic fragrance. It does have some prominent vanilla in it, and it can be very cloying. This is one of those fragrances that I wouldn't dare wear in heat. I will only wear this on cooler days, maybe cold days, or maybe like cool rainy days would be appropriate for Shalimar. In the summer, listen, you will kill someone wearing this. It's spicy. It's got a little bit of leather, has some animalic tones to it. Shalimar. There's a lot of flankers. This is the eau de parfum concentration. There's a cologne. There's an eau de cologne. There's souffle, souffle intense, souffle lumiere, souffle, however you want to pronounce it. There's a bunch of flankers to this now, but Shalimar, you can't deny that this had a really big place in the 80s. Now, I can't talk about Shalimar and I can't talk about Opium without also talking about these next two. I don't have bottles of these. I have put them in my cart, taken them out of my cart. I'm undecided. Can you help me decide if I need these back in my collection? The first is Paloma Picasso. I remember this bottle sitting on my mom's dresser and me being a little girl, like looking over the edge of the dresser. She had a really high dresser where the mirror was taller up, not just at waist height, but taller. So I had to get on my tippy toes and look over. I remember seeing the bottle of Paloma Picasso. It was also at that point in time a dabber. You kind of had to splash it on you a little bit. So I remember this being super woody, super strong. And I remember it being spicy like Shalimar and like Opium. Although I'm looking at the main accords here on Fragrantica and it's talking about it being musky and floral. I don't remember that. I remember it being really woody and really spicy and in some ways overwhelming and way too grown up for when I was trying to wear it at like 8, 9, 10 years old. And the other that's right up there with Opium, with Shalimar, with Paloma Picasso for me is Oscar de la Renta, the original Oscar. This was a big floral, also super woody, super ambery, super spicy. It's hard for me to really distinguish these four fragrances in the memory in my mind of the 80s. I'm sure if I had them in hand today and could sniff them one to the other, I would understand the differences. But in my little girl's mind, all four of these are sitting up on my mom's shelf together. They're all these really big grown-up fragrances for ladies that were a lot older than me. You know, I was that little girl sort of looking up to them and almost being suffocated by these fragrances. It wasn't until now that I'm in my 40s that I could really appreciate them. Speaking of overwhelming grown-up animalic fragrances, can we talk about Knowing from Estee Lauder? This fragrance, I remember purchasing an original formulation of this in the 2000s. It was maybe like 2004 or 5. I got it secondhand off of eBay. and tried it for a while and got so overwhelmed with it that I sold it back off. I recently repurchased this one. It's a newer, formulation. This is a super woody, spicy, earthy number. Also has a strong animalic tone in it to me. It's also powdery, it's mossy. Those are some of the accords in there that stand out. It says there's some white florals. This is not a fragrance that I would call a floral. This is one that I would call strong woods, spice, and earth. Knowing this is a tough fragrance to wear. A lot of people really hate it. They can't stand it for more than a second. They don't even like smelling it on other people. They can't stand it. But this is a strong 80s fragrance to me, Estee Lauder. Next, we're going to go into some fragrances that I think are still more worn today, even though they can also be a little bit tough. We're going to start with Obsession from Calvin Klein. Now, I had one of the originals that came in a different bottle. If I find a picture, I'll link it here. This is, I think, a newer bottle, if I'm not mistaken. This is the Eau de Parfum concentration. This is another spicy, ambery, woody fragrance with a heavy vanilla tone to it. It also has a little bit of musk. This can also be a tough fragrance to wear for people, but maybe not quite as much as your Shalimar, your Knowing, Opium, the Paloma Picasso one. This one is more comforting, more like a hug, if you will. It has something a little bit smoother and sweeter, probably because of the vanilla accord in here. And it's also, like I said, a little powdery. But boy, did I wear the heck out of Obsession. I thought it was so cool to dab this on and smell like I was grown. Not to mention the crazy Calvin Klein ads that really took over the late 80s into the 90s with some of the 90s productions from Calvin Klein. Speaking of Calvin Klein, there's no denying eternity with the Calvin Klein ads. This is so distinctive to me. I would know this fragrance anywhere on anyone, I think. It has this really distinctive carnation note. This is a huge, like floral fragrance. But what stands out to me the most in this is this carnation note. It's also considered green, aromatic, citrusy, a little powdery. Yes, there's some spiciness in this, but green and floral is what comes out to me the most. In Eternity, I have to be in the mood to wear this for sure, just like any of these 80s fragrances, really. But this one in particular, it's one that can be a little bit headache-inducing if you're not in the mood, but can be completely beautiful if you are. It's such a lovely fragrance and so unique. I've not smelled anything else like this anywhere. Eternity. Next, we go to Poison from Christian Dior. I wore some Poison to death, no pun intended, in the 80s and into the 90s. This today, a lot of people talk about it being a tuberose fragrance. Yes, it's got a tuberose note in here, but it's a very fruity, like a dark, fruity floral fragrance to me. It's also woody and spicy a little bit, and it has a honey accord in here, which I find interesting. There are a lot of flankers of Poison. So this is the original Eau de Parfum, a reformulated version, but the original nonetheless. I also wore the one in the green bottle, the Tundra version. And what do I have now? I think I have another flanker of this that I can't remember off the top of my head. But this one here, I felt so grown getting my little bottle of Poison, you guys, and spraying myself down. And no offense to our younger ladies, certainly I had my moment where I oversprayed to death. I'm still an oversprayer. But then these fragrances were powerful, like boom. So to spray this head to toe the way that I did really should have been quite a crime. But I did, and I'm sure, I knocked a few people out. I will go to class in this, y'all. It's true. Another fragrance that I almost killed people wearing was Chantilly from Dana or Dana, depending on how you want to say that. It's got some citrus and florals in here, a lot of vanilla. It's spicy, but it's also like powdery. It's interesting that on Fragrantica, the powdery accord is listed further down and citrus is listed at the top. To me, this is more of like a heavy, soft, How can you be heavy and soft at the same time? But I'm going to proceed with that. A heavy, soft, flowery, powdery fragrance. And I would douse myself in this. I'm talking about like rain shower. And then I would have the nerve to go to band practice. Now, if you've ever been in a marching band, you know that you're in close quarters with other people. And we'd be marching around in the gym practicing our formations and stuff. And I'm pretty sure that you could smell this several blocks away on me. Chantilly. A fragrance that screamed class and sophistication, that had a day in the 80s, although it was released in the late 70s, is Lauren by Ralph Lauren. Very green to me, a green floral. In fact, this has some things in common, at least in the opening, with Estee Lauder Private Collection, in that they give you like a wet garden feel. This also dries down a little bit more woody than this one does, whereas this one stays pretty wet garden smell. This one gets a little bit more woody as it dries down. This is not a favorite fragrance of mine now. I have this for nostalgia's sake, and I will certainly wear it from time to time. But it's definitely got that 80s floral green DNA to it. And I just remember thinking we were super fancy because we had a bottle of Lauren from Ralph Lauren from the department store. You know, shopping in the department store was a really big deal if you were a kid that grew up in the South Bronx like me, and you got to hop on the train and go downtown into the city, down to Macy's on 34th Street or to Bloomingdale's or one of those huge department stores in the city and get a fragrance like this. I won't spend a lot of time on the next one because I have a video that I just recently did on this, which I'll link below, and it is Calyx from Prescriptives. This is the original Prescriptives formulation, not the new Clinique one. That one I understand is a little bit softer and maybe a little bit weaker. This is the super loud, in your face version that was released in the 80s. And I remember it was released in 87. Anyway, I won't get into a lot of details. Go check out the video. But this is just a gorgeous fragrance. Another one you have to really be in the mood for. It is loud, loud. Ugh. But just so beautiful when you are in the mood. You can see that I am nursing this bottle and really being very stingy with how often I use this because I want to keep this original gorgeous bottle. I saved what I think is the queen of 80s fragrances for the end. Let me know if you agree. That doesn't mean that these other fragrances don't also deserve a crown as being a really big, iconic 80s fragrance. But can we deny that Giorgio was the fragrance of the 80s? Giorgio Beverly Hills. Again, we're seeing a theme here. This is a huge, larger than life fragrance. It's mostly a white floral. It has tuberose in there. It also has an animalic accord, and it is out there. You spray this thing on and you are taking over a room with it. People are going to smell you a mile away. Maybe not in a good way. This is another one that you really have to be in the mood for because it's such a specific kind of smell. It's so hard to describe. It's like super concentrated hairspray meets the very essence of a floral bouquet concentrated down into super potent floral notes with some aldehydes. Are there any aldehydes in here? Because I'm certainly picking some up. Let's look. No, there's no aldehydes listed, at least not on Fragrantica, but I'm picking up some of that super clean laundry smell mixed with heavy florals, mixed with an animalic tone, mixed with something green. Giorgio Beverly Hills. This is another one. If you wanted people to run away from you, you just had to spray this 3 or 4 times and they would certainly know to leave your space. This takes over everything. The queen of the 80s, Giorgio Beverly Hills. What did I forget to add to the list? What would you add that you remember as really iconic in the 80s that either came out in the late 70s and had their day in the 80s or came out in the 80s? Would love to hear what you would have added to this list. Hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one.